Picture a mining colony at the edge of known space. The workers got here the way workers get everywhere. They chase the kind of contract that pays enough to justify 6 months away from home, in a place so far from Earth that the distance itself becomes its own psychological pressure. These are not fragile people. They spend their working hours operating machinery that can split open a planet. They calibrate equipment in vacuumed space, run maintenance cycles in places that would kill an unprotected person in minutes, and navigate the specific social compression that comes from being trapped with the same faces in a facility sized for function rather than comfort. They adapted to difficulty long before they arrived here. By any reasonable standard, they are tough. Then a marker gets uncovered in the rock. Everything comes apart. It doesn't happen at once. That is the first thing to understand about Dead Space, and it is the thing that makes the franchise more disturbing the more carefully you examine it. Nobody wakes up one morning and decides to start carving symbols into the walls. What happens is quieter. Sleep becomes difficult. Then sleep becomes impossible. Dreams stop being dreams and start being something else. A pressure behind the eyes that has no source. A sound in the static that almost resembles a voice. A growing certainty, sourceless and unwelcome, that something fundamental has gone wrong. People who were calm become suspicious. People who were suspicious become certain of things they cannot explain or defend. And then, after the suspicious and the certain have escalated past what reason can handle, the violence begins. Not like a switch being thrown, more like a door that had been swinging open by fractions of a degree for weeks, until one day it runs out of hinges. That is how Dead Space begins. Not with monsters, with minds. Every necromorph in this franchise started as a person. Every corrupted crew member, every converted colonist, every body repurposed into something that hunts through darkened corridors, was once someone who clocked in for a shift and expected to clock out. The body horror gets most of the attention. The creature design, the grotesque anatomy of what infection does to a human frame, the visual language of transformation. But underneath all of that, running through every game in this franchise, from the Ishimura's first distress signal to the final revelations on Tau Volantis, is a quieter horror. The horror of what the marker does to minds before it ever touches bodies. Tonight we are going through every major psychological condition in Dead Space, every character whose mind fractures under the marker's influence, every disorder that gets found and then amplified, every moment where the most frightening thing on screen is not a creature but a person who has crossed some line they cannot come back from. We are examining complicated grief, psychotic breaks, paranoid delusions, dissociative states, trauma responses, the specific psychology of religious fanaticism, cult dynamics, mass panic, survivor's guilt, and what happens when you spend 3 years in a psychiatric facility under memory suppression while a government agency harvests the marker blueprint your brain is generating whether you want it to or not. This video is an attempt to pull apart that horror layer by layer, examining the specific psychological and psychiatric conditions Dead Space builds its world around. The goal here is interpretation and analysis, not a summary of what happened. The goal is to understand what these characters' breakdowns reveal about the human mind, about what grief does when it goes unsupported, about what institutions do to vulnerable people when those people are more useful damaged than healed. By the end, you are going to understand something about this franchise that shifts how you see every character in it. Not just what the marker does, why it works on the people it works on, why it is effective in ways that are specific and personal rather than universal and random, why grief is not just a theme running through Dead Space but a mechanism, something the marker aims like a tool. And the reason it works so well is more uncomfortable than anything walking in the Ishimura's corridors. If something in this video resonates with you, please drop a comment letting me know. This is part of my Madness series, which covers mental disorders in several game franchises. If you are interested in seeing more, be sure to check out my playlist of all those. You can also suggest a topic for a future video down in the comments here. Now get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's start. Chapter 1. How the Marker Chooses. The marker's signal does not work the same way on everyone. This is stated clearly within the lore, confirmed by multiple characters who have studied its effects firsthand, and it is the structural key to understanding every psychological breakdown in this franchise. The collapse that follows marker exposure is not uniform. It is not a wave that hits everyone equally and produces the same result. What it is, and what makes the Dead Space universe genuinely sophisticated in its horror framework, is targeted. The signal finds each individual's specific psychological configuration, evaluates it, and then applies pressure at exactly the right point. Start with the mechanism, because it matters. The signal the markers emit works primarily through a specific region of the brain, the lateral geniculate nucleus, a structure that sits within the thalamus between the optic nerves and the visual cortex, serves under normal circumstances as a relay station for visual information. It receives what the eyes send it, and passes the result to the regions responsible for interpretation. Under marker influence, this relay station begins accepting input from a source that is not the eyes. The signal inserts itself into the visual processing chain and begins generating experiences that the brain receives with the same confidence it receives genuine sensory input. The brain does not register this as interference. It registers it as perception, because from the brain's perspective, there is no meaningful distinction between seeing something that exists and seeing something the marker has manufactured. Both arrive at the same destination through the same channel. Both get processed by the same interpretive regions. Both get integrated into the ongoing experience of the person's reality. The brain has no internal alert for this specific category of intrusion, because the intrusion mimics the mechanism so precisely that the alert system cannot find the scene. The real-world condition this most closely resembles is what psychiatrists call organic psychosis. This refers to psychotic symptoms, including hallucinations, delusions, and disorganized cognition, that arise from an external biological cause affecting brain function, rather than from a primary psychiatric illness. Organic psychosis has been documented in cases of high fever, exposure to certain toxins and neurological agents, traumatic brain injury, and various conditions that alter brain chemistry from outside the normal architecture of the mind. What is clinically significant about organic psychosis is that it can affect people with no prior psychiatric history at all. It does not require a pre-existing vulnerability in the traditional diagnostic sense. It requires only that something has altered how the brain processes its own functioning. The marker signal is, within the logic of Dead Space, functioning as exactly this kind of external organic disruptor. It bypasses everything a person might have in terms of psychological resilience or prior mental health. It simply alters the brain's relationship to reality until reality and the marker's construction become impossible to separate from the inside. But the signal's approach is considerably more sophisticated than flooding every brain it reaches with a uniform frequency. The hallucinations the marker produces are not generic. They are assembled from the subject's own memories, their own emotional history, their own particular inner world. Survivors and researchers within the lore document this consistently. The marker's hallucinations are shaped by the feelings and memories of the person experiencing them. A person encountering the signal does not see abstract shapes or anonymous figures. They see people they recognize. They hear voices drawn from their own relationships. The imagery the signal manufactures is constructed from the archive of who the victim actually is. This is a critically important detail, because it means the marker, before it breaks anyone, has to read them. Something in the signal's interaction with the brain functions like an assessment. It finds the emotional landscape. It identifies what the person already carries. And then, based on what it finds, it decides what kind of breakdown will be most useful for the artifact's purposes. For the majority of people it encounters, that assessment produces a simple verdict: drive toward violence, generate corpses, advance the cycle. For a smaller group, people with specific neurological compatibility or intelligence profiles, the assessment produces something more complex. Keep them functional, keep them moving, guide them towards specific tasks, and do this by constructing hallucinations drawn from their own deepest attachments, the things they love most or fear losing most. and making those hallucinations work for the marker rather than for the person. This is not metaphor. Within the dead space lore, this distinction is explicit. The people the marker identifies as capable of replicating and building markers, rather than simply dying and being repurposed, receive hallucinations designed to maintain their cooperation rather than to break them down, and those hallucinations are built from whatever the signal finds when it reads them. The colonists of Aegis VII demonstrate what happens to the majority. Before the outbreak fully begins, before the first body is converted, the colony's records document a population experiencing what reads at first glance like stress responses, insomnia, difficulty concentrating, a sourceless anxiety that spreads through the social environment without a clear trigger. These are the earliest signatures of marker exposure at a population level, and they correspond almost exactly to what psychiatrists call the prodromal phase of acute psychosis. The prodromal phase is the period before a full psychotic break, where functioning degrades steadily. Sleep deteriorates, concentration fractures. The person has a growing sense that something is wrong without being able to identify the source. They are not yet experiencing full hallucinations or delusions, but they are moving toward them through a deterioration that proceeds by degrees rather than by sudden onset. The minor Brant Harris represents one of the most documented early cases. He was not a scientist. He was not a unitologist. He had no particular reason to become a study in what marker exposure does to an ordinary person. He was a worker, and the signal reached him, and what came out was a man who had committed violence against someone he worked with and could not access any sense of having done wrong. His examination records describe a person who showed none of the remorse that typically accompanies violence, even in people who have committed it under extreme psychological duress. When questioned, he became withdrawn and unable to articulate what had happened, describing the knowledge as something stuck behind his eyes that he could sense but not reach. He had also begun writing, compulsively, on every available surface. This writing behavior, which appears across multiple characters in Dead Space at various levels of marker exposure, corresponds to a real neurological phenomenon called hypergraphia. Hypergraphia is an overwhelming and compulsive drive to write, typically accompanied by the belief that the writing contains urgent and essential information. It appears in certain states associated with temporal lobe dysfunction, in some manic episodes, and in certain types of psychosis. The person experiencing it does not choose to write. The writing feels necessary in a way that the conscious mind cannot fully account for. In Brant Harris, in colonists across Aegis VII, and eventually in characters like Isaac Clarke and Nolan Strauss, the compulsive reproduction of the marker's symbols is the brain performing a function it has been redirected to perform. Not a decision, a biological compulsion installed by the signal. What makes the Aegis VII colonists so collectively significant is that their breakdown demonstrates what happens when the marker signal meets a population rather than an individual. The psychological conditions in the colony before the marker was uncovered already had the ingredients for instability: the pressure of isolated industrial work, the specific social compression of a closed community, the fatigue of long contracts in a remote environment. These conditions do not produce breakdown on their own. They are normal, if difficult, features of the working environment, but they create a population already experiencing elevated baseline stress. And elevated baseline stress is precisely the condition in which the marker's signal finds the easiest purchase. What then spreads through the colony resembles what researchers studying mass psychogenic illness have documented in real-world communities under shared threat. Mass psychogenic illness describes a phenomenon where psychological symptoms spread through a group through a combination of shared stress, social transmission, and the amplification of existing fears. The individual symptoms are genuine, the suffering is real, but the spread occurs through social pathways as well as physiological ones, carried from person to person by proximity, observation, and the mounting pressure of watching the people around you deteriorate without understanding why. The marker signal is not a metaphor for mass psychogenic illness. The signal has real and specific neurological effects that are not socially transmitted. but the pattern of its spread through Aegis VII mirrors the real-world phenomenon in structure, a population already under strain, a trigger that operates on the existing vulnerabilities, an escalation that proceeds by observable stages through the social fabric of the community. Depression spreads first, because watching colleagues deteriorate is itself a driver of depressive states. Paranoia follows, because when the people around you are behaving in ways that don't make sense, the rational response is to question your assumptions about who can be trusted. Violence follows the paranoia, because paranoia generates threat perceptions that justify it, and because the individuals most severely affected by the signal begin behaving in ways that make them genuinely dangerous to those around them. By the time the outbreak fully begins, the colony is not a community caught off guard by something sudden. It is a population that the marker spent weeks methodically stripping of every psychological defense that might have allowed organized resistance. The necromorphs inherit a community that has already lost its coherence. And this is the first and most important thing to understand before examining individual characters. The marker did not create weakness in the people it destroyed. It found weakness that already existed, in the conditions of isolated industrial work, in the stresses of that specific community, in the particular lives of the individuals it selected for more precise manipulation. It worked with what was already there. Every breakdown in dead space was loaded before the signal fired. The character who makes this most visible, whose psychological history before marker contact is most fully documented and most directly relevant to understanding why the signal worked on him the way it did, is the one who survives the first game and then spends 3 years in a psychiatric facility being told he is being helped. Isaac Clarke was already carrying something before the Ishimura's distress signal appeared on a display, carrying it with the specific determination of a person who has decided that forward momentum is preferable to stopping long enough to feel the weight. Chapter 2: Isaac's Grief. Isaac Clarke arrives at the Ishimura as someone who hasn't been allowed to fall apart yet. That framing matters more than it might first appear. The question for Isaac, before the marker ever enters the picture, is not whether the grief and guilt he was managing would eventually require serious processing. The question is whether he was going to get to do that processing at a pace and in a context that might have allowed genuine integration. The Ishimura's answer to that question is, with characteristic dead space efficiency, no. His family history establishes the psychological foundation. Isaac's mother, Octavia Clarke, converted to the Church of Unitology at some point before the events of the first game. The conversion was not benign, and its deterioration was not slow. Her mental health declined significantly. The Church's demands and doctrines reshaped her psychology in ways the people around her watched happen and couldn't stop. She gave away the family's financial resources to the Church, and eventually, during a period when Isaac was elsewhere and Nicole had already left for the Ishimura, Octavia killed Isaac's father and then died by her own hand. The Church of Unitology took her body immediately after. It refused to return her. It declined to reveal where she had been taken. Understand what that refusal costs Isaac in psychological terms. He lost both parents in a single violent event. He never had access to their bodies, never had the kind of ritualized closure that funeral practices across every human culture exist to provide. He couldn't bury them, couldn't visit them, had no physical location where the loss could be acknowledged and grieved in the way grief requires a concrete object. And the Church, the institution directly responsible for his mother's deterioration and indirectly implicated in both deaths, walked away with everything that might have helped him begin to process what had happened. Woven into the grief, and potentially more psychologically damaging in the long term than the grief itself, is what happened in the call he made to Nicole in the immediate aftermath of his parents' deaths. He called her in grief. He blamed her for what had happened because she had told him his mother seemed stable enough to come home, and she hadn't been, and he needed somewhere for the rage to go. He said things he recognized as wrong and cruel even as he was saying them. She hung up. She was gone within days aboard the Ishimura. He could not reach her. He could not apologize. The conversation sat there, unrepairable, the last real exchange between them before she went somewhere he could not follow. The clinical literature on grief consistently identifies certain factors as significant predictors of complicated grief disorder, a state where the normal psychological processing of loss stalls and the acute phase of grief persists without the gradual integration that typically occurs over time. Among the strongest predictors is a relationship disrupted by unresolved conflict at the moment of loss. The reason this specific factor carries such weight is tied to how the mind attempts to process loss when the relationship was in a troubled state. The death locks that conflict in place permanently. The resolution you were capable of pursuing while the person was alive is no longer possible. The apology cannot be delivered. The argument cannot finish. The explanation you were going to give when you were both calmer never gets to happen. The relationship exists in the mind of the surviving person as permanently suspended at its worst point, and this suspension creates guilt that has no exit point. Isaac called Nicole in grief, blamed her in grief, recognized his cruelty, and tried immediately to walk it back, watched her hang up, and then lost the ability to fix it. That guilt, without any resolution, was sitting inside him when the Kellyan approached the Ishimura. Alongside it was something that added its own complication, the anger. Isaac harbored a profound resentment toward Unitology specifically because of what it had done to his mother, and therefore to his father, and therefore to his family. That anger was legitimate and understandable. It was also entangled, in ways that were going to be difficult to separate, with his feelings about Nicole, because Nicole had worked in a healthcare context related to the kind of people Unitology preyed on, and his mind had in grief made her partially responsible for something that was far more complicated than any single person's responsibility. He knew on some level that his blame was not fully rational. He was not, by any account within the lore, an unintelligent person. But grief and rage do not require rationality to feel completely convincing. What Isaac is carrying onto the Kellyan, before the marker does anything to him, is this specific cluster, unprocessed grief over both parents, an unresolvable guilt over his last exchange with Nicole, a personal wound around Unitology that is fresh and raw, an attachment to Nicole that contains within it the fear that he has already damaged it beyond repair. And underneath all of it, the forward momentum of a man who has been moving rather than stopping, because stopping means feeling all of this at once. The hope that Nicole is alive is doing significant psychological work for Isaac before the marker ever touches him. If she is alive and reachable and he can get to her, then some version of repair is still possible. The relationship is not permanently suspended at its worst point. He can apologize, he can explain, he can hear her response and begin to know where they stand. If she is dead, he gets none of that. He gets the guilt locked permanently into the moment she hung up. His mother's conversion and death locked permanently into his anger at Unitology, both parents locked permanently into the church's possession, and no repair available anywhere. The marker does not create Isaac's need for Nicole to be alive. That need is already there, complete and functioning, when the signal first reaches him. What the marker does is recognize the need with a precision that should be frightening, and then fill it with something that looks exactly like what the need was reaching for. The Nicole hallucination, within the framework of what we know about how the marker constructs its visions, is assembled from Isaac's own memories and emotional experience of her. This is the mechanism within the lore. The hallucinations are not invented from outside. They are drawn from within the subject's own psychological history, which means the version of Nicole that guides Isaac through the Ishimura is built from everything Isaac actually knows and feels about her. Her voice is right because the marker pulled her voice from Isaac's own memory of her. Her particular way of looking at him is right for the same reason. The warmth, the specific quality of the presence she had in his life, all of this is constructed from the archive Isaac already contains, and here is where the manipulation becomes genuinely sophisticated. The Nicole hallucination is warm toward him. She guides rather than accuses. She is consistently positioned as a reason to keep moving, keep solving, keep pushing forward. The specific emotional texture of the hallucination is precisely calibrated to what Isaac's guilt-carrying, grief-managing psychology most needs in order to continue functioning. The feeling that the relationship is still repairable, that she is still present and approachable, that there is still a version of this that ends with the conflict resolved and the connection intact. A grief hallucination generated purely from within a person's own psychology without external construction tends to be consistent with the emotional state of the relationship at the time of death. Isaac's last real interaction with Nicole was painful and unresolved. If his own grief were generating her presence, that presence would likely carry some of the emotional texture of that last exchange. The Nicole his grief would summon would feel incomplete, would feel like someone who hung up before the call was finished. The Nicole the marker builds feels like someone who never got the bad call, like the relationship never hit that point. And that specifically is what tells us, looking back, that the hallucination was authored rather than generated. It gave Isaac what he most needed the relationship to feel like, rather than what it actually felt like at the moment of her death. Kendra Daniels, near the end of the first game, destroys this architecture by forcing Isaac to watch the video message Nicole recorded before she died. The moment the message ends is the moment the partition collapses. The dissociation that allowed him to hold the evidence of her death at arm's length while believing in her presence simply cannot survive direct confrontation with her saying goodbye. What happens to Isaac in the moments immediately following this revelation is consistent with what the clinical literature describes in cases of acute traumatic disclosure, the sudden, involuntary accessing of grief that has been partitioned away for an extended period. He loses the structure that was holding him upright. He loses the hope that was keeping him moving. He loses the version of reality in which some repair was still possible, and then he keeps going anyway. Because the necromorphs are still there, and the hive mind is still there, and he is still the only person in a position to do anything about any of it. This is consistent with how survival psychology functions in genuinely life-threatening situations. Acute grief processing gets deferred when immediate physical danger requires all available cognitive and emotional resources. The mind files the loss in a temporary space and commits those resources to survival. The processing happens later. Isaac's processing does not happen later. What happens instead is 3 years in a psychiatric facility under the management of people who have decided his broken mind is more valuable than his healed one. But the timeline needs to stay in order, because there is a sequence to understand before Dead Space 2 can make full sense. We need to look at what the marker built for Terrence Kyne, using grief as the raw material in the same way it used grief for Isaac, but producing a completely different outcome. We need to understand why the same mechanism operating on the same emotional wound arrived at such different places in two different people. Because that difference is where the marker reveals something about grief that the franchise has been building toward from the moment Aegis VII appeared on a scanner. Chapter 3: The Hallucination as Mirror. The distinction between a grief hallucination and a psychotic hallucination matters in clinical practice, and it matters here. Research on bereavement, accumulating since the 90s, has consistently found that hallucinations of the deceased are one of the most common features of acute grief. Studies place the rate somewhere between 40 and 80% of bereaved individuals, depending on methodology and population. Widows and widowers are particularly likely to report sensing the presence of the person they lost, hearing their voice in familiar rooms, seeing them in crowds before the recognition catches up, or experiencing vivid dreams that feel substantively different from ordinary dreaming. These experiences are considered, within current clinical understanding, a normal component of the grief response. They are the brain's attempt to maintain a psychological connection with someone who is no longer physically present. The mechanism behind them operates from within. They draw on genuine memory, on the accumulated sensory impression of years of relationship, on the particular way a person moved or spoke or occupied the space around them. They feel like the person who is gone precisely because they are constructed from everything the living person actually knows about them. They are not intrusions, they are productions of the grieving mind's own processing. Two things separate these normal grief hallucinations from the hallucinations the marker produces. First, the bereaved person experiencing a grief hallucination typically maintains awareness on some level that the experience is internally generated rather than external reality. They feel it as comforting precisely because it does not fully demand belief. They know she is gone, and yet she is here in some way that is real enough to feel like presence rather than absence. The experience lives in that in-between space. Second, a grief hallucination serves the emotional needs of the bereaved person. It appears in ways consistent with who the deceased actually was. It offers comfort or the sense of continued connection in a form the grieving mind can use. What the marker constructs in Isaac's mind is neither of these things. The Nicole hallucination serves the marker's agenda. In the first game, this agenda and Isaac's emotional needs are close enough that the distinction is functionally invisible from the outside. The marker needs Isaac moving, solving problems, advancing towards specific goals. Isaac needs to feel like Nicole is alive and the relationship is still repairable. Both needs are served by a hallucination that is warm, guiding, perpetually just ahead of him in a way that keeps him moving forward. The experience feels like a grief hallucination serving his emotional needs, because in the first game, those needs and the marker's goals happen to align. In Dead Space 2, 3 years later, the alignment breaks. The Nicole that appears to Isaac on Titan Station is different. She is hostile, accusatory. She presses on his guilt, challenges his choices, confronts him with the version of himself he most fears being. This shift cannot be explained by a change in Isaac's emotional state. His grief is still genuine. His attachment to her memory is still real. If the hallucination were generated purely by his own psychology, it would not suddenly shift from comfort to confrontation while his emotional needs remained essentially the same. The shift is caused by a change in what the marker needs from him. The marker convergence machine on Titan Station is something Isaac would, if calm and rational, be able to think his way around avoiding. The marker needs him to approach it, and the hallucination adapts its behavior to create the destabilization that compliance requires. It becomes the voice of his worst fear about himself, the accusatory presence that confirms every doubt he carries about whether he is responsible for what happened, whether his denial was a form of culpability, whether he failed everyone by surviving when they didn't. Fear of that quality, amplified through the one voice that carries the most weight with him, pushes him toward the compliance the marker requires. The hallucination is not Nicole's grief for him. It is the marker's tool, built to look like Nicole's grief for him. This difference is the thing the first game deliberately obscures and the second game reveals. Dead Space 2 makes the machinery visible by letting the tool drop its pleasant face and reveal the construction underneath. The Nicole that guided Isaac through the Ishimura was always authored by the same signal that tried to drive the Aegis VII colonists into violence. The method was different. The purpose was the same. The clinical framework that fits most cleanly onto what Isaac experiences across both games is something that doesn't have a single clean diagnostic label, because the combination of factors involved is unusual enough that the standard categories apply only in parts. What he is experiencing is most accurately described as an organic psychosis with dissociative features occurring in the context of complicated grief, with the psychotic content specifically constructed and maintained by an external signal rather than generated endogenously. The psychosis provides the hallucinations. The dissociation provides the partition that allowed him to hold knowledge of Nicole's likely death at arm's length while believing in her presence. The complicated grief provides the emotional raw material the marker used to construct the hallucination from the inside out. Psychosis, stripped of its horror framing, is a category of experience rather than a single condition. What all psychotic states share is a disruption of the relationship between the mind and external reality. The person experiencing psychosis cannot access the distinction between internally generated experience and external reality, not because they lack intelligence or willpower, but because the architecture of perception itself has been altered. The mechanism that normally generates the experience of reality is generating something else, and from inside, the two are indistinguishable. For Isaac, this means the Nicole he sees is not translucent or ghostly in his experience of her. She is there. She has continuity and knowledge of their shared history and the particular emotional texture of the real person. From where he stands, she is present. The player can see the unreality in the framing and the camera, but Isaac cannot access that external perspective. He is inside the experience with no vantage point from which to evaluate it. Sit with that for a moment. Separate from the horror mechanics. The most intimate hallucination possible is one built from the person you loved most. The brain does not need to invent anything from scratch. It already holds everything: the voice, the way she used to look at him, the particular quality of warmth she brought into the space between them, the thousands of small impressions accumulated over years of knowing someone. Grief normally keeps those things alive in memory, which is painful, but ultimately serves the slow work of integration. The marker takes that entire archive and makes it walk and speak and guide and eventually turn on him. There is something in that which sits in a category that requires a different word than horror. The closest real-world analogy is what grief counselors sometimes encounter in cases where a bereaved person's continuing bond with the deceased has become so consuming that the distinction between memory and presence has blurred to the point of dysfunction. Except that in Isaac's case, his grief didn't do this to him. Something else did it to him, using his grief as the mechanism. His love for Nicole, one of the most human and ordinary things about him, became the instrument by which he was steered. Understanding this fully requires understanding why the marker chose to build a Nicole for Isaac rather than driving him into the paranoid violence it used on the colonists. The answer is not in Isaac's resilience or his strength of character. The answer is in what the marker read in him when the signal first reached his brain and ran its assessment. Isaac's neural architecture, his imprint from marker 3A after the events on Aegis VII, made him compatible with something more complex than cannon fodder. He was one of the rare individuals the signal identified as capable of building and replicating a marker. For that purpose, the marker needed him functional, directed, and moving towards specific goals. The hallucination of Nicole was not a gift. It was a management strategy. The marker built the one thing that would keep Isaac Clarke moving through an environment that would have shut almost anyone else down. And it built it from his grief because his grief was what it found when it looked. This is the pattern that the entire franchise is built on, and it appears twice more in the first game alone. In forms close enough to Isaac's experience to be recognizable, and different enough to show how the same mechanism produces different outcomes depending on what it finds. One of those cases involves a man who had spent 7 years grieving his wife, and found that grief turned into a voice that steered him toward his own end, believing all the while that he was doing something good. The other case involves a man who spent years trying not to think about what he had done, and found that the marker could force him to think about it, very slowly, in front of an audience. Both of those cases are coming. One of them raises a question about grief and love and manipulation that the franchise never fully answers, and the absence of that answer is exactly where the real horror lives. But keep Terence Kyne in mind as we move forward. Keep the specific image of a scientist who studied the marker's effects on human minds for years, who understood intellectually that it found wounds and pulled them open, and who still had absolutely no defense against it when it found his, because knowing what a trap looks like, and avoiding the trap when the bait is someone you lost 7 years ago and still grieve every day, are two different things entirely, and the marker understands that difference better than the people it uses. Chapter 4. Kyne and the Widow. There is a specific cruelty in how the marker found Terence Kyne. Not the cruelty of violence or sudden destruction, the other kind, the kind that reaches into the thing a person built their life around after the worst loss they ever experienced, and turns it against them so gently that they never feel the turning. By the time the marker was done with Terence Kyne, it had used both of the structures he had used to survive grief, his faith and his work. It pointed both of them in its own direction and let him walk there believing he was doing something good. Kyne was the chief science officer aboard the Ishimura. He was a Unitologist, deeply committed to the religion in ways that had intellectual as well as devotional roots. He had spent years studying the limited information available about the black marker found on Earth, building theoretical frameworks around what the markers were and what they meant. He was the church's lead expert on marker science aboard the Ishimura. By professional and theological positioning, He was probably the most qualified person on the ship to understand what was happening when the signal started affecting the crew and the colony. He also knew what grief felt like from the inside. His wife, Amelia, had died 7 years before the Ishimura reached Aegis VII. He had found comfort in unitology during that period, which is not a surprising choice and not an irrational one. Grief pushes people toward frameworks that can contain the magnitude of the loss. Religion, philosophy, community, work. For Kine, his faith provided a structure within which Amelia's death was not simply an ending, but something with meaning, with a place in a larger pattern. His unitology gave him somewhere to put the loss. The marker took that structure and wore it. After his encounter with Kendra Daniels, who was trying to understand the outbreak and stop it, Kine reportedly began to sense a presence he identified as Amelia, not immediately visible, at first only a voice. This is consistent with the progressive stages of marker-induced hallucination, documented across multiple cases. The auditory phase comes first, typically presenting as voices that feel like they originate from outside the person, before the experience escalates into full visual hallucinations. Kine heard his wife's voice 7 years after her death, and whatever rational defenses his scientific training might have offered him in other circumstances, those defenses did not hold. Because here is the thing that the Kine case illustrates with particular clarity. Knowing that the marker produces hallucinations and experiencing a hallucination as real are two completely different things. Kine knew. He had studied the effects on the Aegis VII colonists. He had tried to raise concerns with Captain Matthias about what the signal was doing to the people around them. He had the intellectual framework to understand exactly the mechanism by which a voice claiming to be his dead wife might have appeared in his mind, and it didn't matter. The distinction between understanding a phenomenon abstractly and being immune to it is one of the most consistently documented and least intuitively obvious facts about human psychology. Therapists who specialize in treating trauma are not immune to developing trauma responses. Psychiatrists who understand the mechanism of depression are not protected from developing depression. Understanding how the brain generates a particular experience does not give the mind the ability to refuse that experience when the conditions for generating it are met. The awareness is real. The experience overrides it. What the marker found in Kine was a 7-year grief that had been managed, integrated to a functional degree, built around by the structures of his faith and his work, but never fully resolved. Grief of that length and that depth rarely is. The acute pain softens over years, but the absence remains, and with it the particular weight of a relationship that ended before everything that could have been said was said. 7 years of living with that weight does not eliminate the weight. It builds adaptations around it. And adaptations, unlike the weight itself, can be navigated around. The voice of Amelia told Kine that returning the marker to its pedestal on Aegis VII would calm the hive mind and stop the outbreak. From a certain perspective, this was not entirely irrational advice. The marker being returned to its source was, in fact, something that could temporarily contain the effects of the signal. The marker's manipulation here is particularly sophisticated. The hallucination steered Kine towards something that was adjacent to correct, something his own scientific reasoning could partially support, rather than towards something obviously delusional. This is a hallmark of the most effective manipulation, the kind that doesn't require the target to abandon their own judgment entirely, but rather nudges that judgment in a direction that serves a different agenda. The clinical category of delusional disorder is useful here, though it applies imperfectly. Delusional disorder in the diagnostic literature refers to a condition characterized by one or more non-bizarre delusions, meaning beliefs that involve situations that could occur in real life, even if they are false, persisting over a significant period. What distinguishes delusional disorder from the broader category of psychosis is that the delusions tend to be circumscribed. The person's functioning in areas unrelated to the delusion is often relatively intact. They can carry on conversations, perform tasks, maintain a degree of social functioning. The break from reality is focused around a specific set of beliefs rather than being diffuse. Kine's experience maps partially onto this picture. His hallucination of Amelia functions less like a full psychotic break and more like a targeted delusion built around a specific emotional wound. His scientific reasoning remains partially operative. He is still capable of planning, of communicating, of attempting to act on what he believes is correct. He holds others hostage, attempts to access the marker, and when that fails, he continues trying to find another path to what Amelia told him he needed to do. The delusion is the organizing framework around which the other cognitive functions continue to operate, however imperfectly. This is actually more frightening than a total break. Total breaks are visible. They announce themselves. A person who has lost all contact with reality is difficult to miss in an operational environment. A person who has maintained most of their functioning while a specific, targeted delusion has become the steering mechanism for their decisions is someone who can keep making consequential choices, keep acting in ways that affect others, and remain completely unavailable to correction on the one point where correction matters most. Kine keeps trying to fix things until the moment Kendra Daniels shoots him. His last words, reaching for Amelia, are consistent with the state he was in throughout. A man who had lost something central to himself and had been given in the most harrowing possible way a final version of it to hold on to. He died thinking he was going to her. Whether he was going anywhere at all is a question the franchise leaves exactly as unanswered as it should be. But the psychological reading of what happened to Kine has nothing to do with the supernatural. It has everything to do with 7 years of grief, meeting a signal that was looking specifically for what grief looks like. What the marker found in Kine is the specific vulnerability that extended grief creates, the long habituated absence of someone whose presence the mind never stopped expecting. The structures that develop around grief over years are adaptations, not resolutions, and the marker, when it identifies those adaptations, knows exactly where the wound underneath them still sits. The character coming up next experienced something from the marker that looked different from what it did to Isaac and Kine on the surface. No grief hallucination, no vision of a loved one pointing the way. What Mercer received from the marker was knowledge, and what he did with that knowledge is one of the most specific case studies in this franchise in what happens when ideology and pathology find each other in a sealed environment with no one to intervene. Chapter 5. Mercer's Sacred Sickness. Dr. Chalice Mercer was a devout Unitologist before the Ishimura reached Aegis VII. This matters because the marker's approach to Mercer was different from what it did to Isaac or Kine, and that difference tells us something important about how the signal calibrates itself to the specific configuration of each mind it encounters. Isaac carried grief that needed a presence. Kine carried grief that needed a voice. Mercer carried something else, a theological certainty that was looking for confirmation, and a psychology that was more comfortable with domination than with doubt. The knowledge Mercer received from the marker signal was described in his own records as new surgical techniques and new technical designs, not a hallucination, not a vision of someone he had loved and lost. The marker identified in Mercer a mind that was intellectually compatible with a specific kind of information transfer, and gave him precisely that. It did not manage him through emotional manipulation the way it managed Isaac. It gave him something he wanted. Knowledge that confirmed his faith was correct, that the necromorphs were what the doctrines said they were, that convergence was not a promise but a mechanism. The effect on Mercer was immediate and then progressive. He used the surgical knowledge to experiment on Brant Harris, the crew member whose marker-induced dementia had made him a particularly illuminating subject for Mercer's research. Rather than treating Harris or trying to help him, Mercer injected necromorph biomatter into Harris's brain tissue in an attempt to access the marker-imprinted regions of his mind more directly. The goal was to unlock information. Harris was the mechanism for achieving it. Pause on that for a moment. Mercer was a doctor. He had training and presumably a history of practice that involved, at minimum, a formal commitment to patient welfare. What he did to Brant Harris represents the complete collapse of that framework, replaced by something that used the vocabulary of science while serving a theological agenda and satisfying what can only be described as a sadistic impulse that had been waiting for a justifying framework. The clinical literature on what's sometimes called malignant narcissism, a constellation of narcissistic, antisocial, and sadistic features, describes a personality configuration in which cruelty is experienced not as morally problematic, but as satisfying and justified. People with significant sadistic personality features, particularly when those features operate within an ideological framework that grants them permission, do not experience their cruelty as cruelty. They experience it as purpose, as work, as something they are entitled to pursue because the framework they operate within has told them the objects of their behavior are not owed the consideration that cruelty would otherwise require. For Mercer, Unitology provided exactly this framework, and the marker's signal amplified it to the point where all restraint dissolved. The necromorphs, in Mercer's theological understanding, were not victims of a horrific infection. They were God's children, the natural successors to humanity. Their emergence from human corpses did not represent death and desecration, but transformation and elevation. Within this framework, the colonists and crew members who died and were converted were not suffering, they were ascending. And anyone who tried to stop this process, including Isaac Clarke, including Terrence Kyne, including any crew member who attempted resistance, was standing between humanity and its divine destiny. This is a functional theology, in the sense that it is internally consistent and provides an answer to every ethical objection. Someone confronting Mercer with the horror of what was happening around them would find themselves arguing against a complete system of interpretation that had already processed and resolved every counter-argument within its own terms. The necromorphs are sacred, their creation is sacred, opposing them is heresy. The logic is circular and sealed. It cannot be penetrated from outside because it generates its own responses to external pressure. In the real-world psychological literature, this kind of sealed ideological system is studied in contexts ranging from religious extremism to cult psychology to certain personality pathologies where the belief system and the personality structure have become mutually reinforcing. What makes it particularly resistant to intervention is that the person experiencing it is not, from their own perspective, doing anything wrong. They are operating within a framework that has answered the moral questions to their own satisfaction. External reality that contradicts the framework is not evidence against the framework. It is a test of faith, or a trick of the enemy, or simply incorrect. Mercer's specific innovation within this framework was the creation of the Hunter, a necromorph capable of regenerating dismembered limbs. This required significant scientific knowledge, presumably drawing on what the marker had given him, applied in service of what he considered a divine mission. He had created something unprecedented in necromorph biology. He was proud of this. His logs reflect a man who was experiencing his work as both scientific achievement and spiritual service, two forms of meaning that had been fused into a single activity. The sadism is inseparable from the religious framework in Mercer's case, and this is the specific diagnostic complexity his character presents. The marker's signal found in Mercer a pre-existing ideological certainty that already contained in its Unitologist doctrine a permission structure for what might otherwise be understood as monstrous acts. The signal did not install that permission structure. It found it already there, and then removed the last inhibitions that had been keeping it from full expression. Mercer, before marker contact, was a devoted Unitologist who presumably managed whatever impulses his personality contained within the norms of professional and social functioning. After marker contact, the amplification of his certainty eliminated the need for those norms, because the framework now told him he had transcended them. The end of Mercer's arc is entirely consistent with where his psychology had been heading from the moment the signal reached him. He feeds himself to an infector, deliberately presents himself to be converted, to undergo the transformation he had been facilitating in others. Within his theological framework, this is not a death, it is the final confirmation of everything he believed. He has joined what he considered the divine. What the marker did to Mercer was not to break him the way it broke the colonists. It found in him something that was already oriented toward the direction the marker needed, already committed to outcomes that served the artifact's purposes, and gave it complete permission to operate without restraint. The result was not a man whose mind the marker destroyed. The result was a man whose pre-existing pathology the marker cultivated to its full expression and then harvested. The difference between what happened to Kine and what happened to Mercer is the difference between grief and ideology as entry points for the signal. Both are wounds of a kind, but grief reaches inward toward loss and connection. Ideology reaches outward toward purpose and permission. The marker used both in both men, but what came out was completely different because the wound was different. Both trajectories arrive at the same endpoint, dead in the Ishimura. One of them died still hoping to fix things. The other died convinced he had fixed them. Before we reach Nolan Strauss, there is one more character from the first game whose breakdown reveals something specific about what happens when the marker's signal finds authority. Because Mercer and Kine both operated under someone else's command, someone whose descent into paranoid certainty determined, more than any other single factor, how catastrophically the situation on the Ishimura escalated before any necromorph ever came through a vent. Chapter 6: The Captain Unravels. Captain Matthias was not a complicated man in the way Kine or Mercer was complicated. He was a highly ranked Unitologist in a position of authority over the most important marker recovery mission the Church had ever organized. His psychology before marker contact was already oriented around two things: his faith and his mission. Everything else was secondary. The marker, when it reached him, found exactly what it expected to find in a man in that position with that orientation, and it pressed on it in a direction that served the artifact's purposes with very little adjustment required. What happened to Matthias fits the clinical picture of paranoid delusion more cleanly than most other cases in Dead Space, and this clarity is useful for understanding the category even if the cause is unusual. Paranoid delusion in the clinical literature refers to a fixed, false belief organized around the theme of persecution, conspiracy, or threat. The person experiencing it is certain that they are being targeted, that others are working against them, that their situation requires defensive action against enemies who may not be visible as enemies. Unlike paranoid personality disorder, which is a persistent trait-level pattern, paranoid delusion in the context of psychosis can develop in a person with no prior history of paranoid thinking, triggered by the specific conditions that produce the psychotic state. After the marker was loaded aboard the Ishimura, Matthias became increasingly focused on a single objective: getting the marker back to Earth. The colony below was being torn apart. His own crew were reporting symptoms of the dementia they were witnessing. The evidence that something had gone catastrophically wrong was accumulating with every passing hour. Matthias's response was to quarantine the colony, refuse to send aid, block outgoing communications, and insist that the mission took precedence over everything else. The paranoid component emerged in his interpretation of anyone who disagreed with him. Kine, who raised concerns about the marker's effects on the colonists and crew, was not experienced by Matthias as a colleague offering important information. He was experienced as an obstacle, as someone working against the mission. The quarantine, the communication blockade, the refusal to engage with evidence that contradicted his certainty, these are the behavioral signatures of a mind that has organized around a fixed belief and begun interpreting all external input through that belief, rather than allowing external input to update the belief. This is sometimes described in the organizational psychology literature as the commander effect, a well-documented phenomenon in high-stakes environments where the authority held by a leader interacts with their certainty in ways that prevent correct information from being heard and acted upon. When a commander's confidence becomes the dominant signal in the room, the people who could provide corrective information face the choice between the danger of the situation they're trying to report and the social, professional, and sometimes physical danger of contradicting the commander. In Matthias's case, the marker's signal was amplifying the certainty that the mission was correct and everyone questioning it was a threat, and his institutional authority meant that this amplified certainty had direct control over life and death decisions. The colonists of Aegis VII died in greater numbers because help was withheld. Communications that might have brought outside intervention were blocked. Crew members who could have organized effective resistance against the early stages of the outbreak were instead being managed around a commander whose decision-making had been captured by paranoid certainty about his mission's importance. This is the specific horror of Matthias that tends to get overlooked in favor of the more visceral horrors surrounding him. He was not attacking people. He was not conducting experiments on them. He was doing something arguably more destructive. He was using his legitimate authority in a state of marker-amplified paranoid certainty to prevent the responses that might have changed the outcome. Every hour of delay, every blocked communication, every suppressed report, these were not malicious in the way Mercer's actions were malicious. They emerged from a mind that was certain it was doing the right thing. Certainty without the ability to update in response to evidence is one of the most dangerous states a human being can occupy, particularly a human being in a position of authority over other people's lives. The marker's signal, in Matthias's case, did not need to install violence or elaborate delusion. It only needed to take the certainty that was already there, the genuine conviction of a devout believer in a mission he considered sacred, and amplify it past the threshold where external reality could still reach it. Kine's decision to attempt to sedate him led to the struggle that ended Matthias's life, a death that was not witnessed clearly enough from a single angle to determine whether it was accident or act. What is clear is that by the time Kine felt the need to act, Matthias had already been the marker's most useful tool for slowing any effective response to the outbreak, not through violence, through authority placed in service of certainty that could not be questioned. Every organizational disaster, from failed maritime missions to aviation crashes to medical errors, has case studies in the literature on what happens when authority and certainty become sealed against incoming information. The marker did not create this dynamic. It found the conditions for it in the command structure of the Ishimura, and pressed until the structure did what sealed systems under pressure always do. It fractured along exactly the lines that the marker had found most useful. Matthias became a necromorph after his death. His body was repurposed like any other. But the damage he did while still alive, to people who might have survived, to systems that might have contained the outbreak, exceeded anything he would have managed through direct violence. Keep that in mind, because the next character we examine experienced the marker's effect in a way that was slower, more deliberate, and aimed at something more specific than authority or ideology or even grief. What the marker found in Nolan Strauss was a wound so specific and so unbearable that the man himself had built an entire internal fiction to keep from having to look at it directly. The marker didn't just open that wound, it made Strauss look at it, in front of his hallucinations of the people his wound was about, in front of Isaac Clarke, who could not see what Strauss was seeing and therefore could not do anything to stop the looking. Nobody who discusses Dead Space 2 gives this the attention it deserves, and the reason it deserves attention is that what happened to Strauss is the most precise case study in the franchise of what happens when the thing the marker finds is not grief over someone else, but guilt over something you did. Chapter 7. Strauss begins to break. Nolan Strauss was a senior scientist. His contact with a fragment of the marker from Aegis VII produced the same marker-induced dementia that affected Isaac Clarke, but what the marker found when it reached Strauss was different from what it found when it reached Isaac. And the difference in outcome is the thing that reveals the most about how the signal calibrates itself to individual psychological wounds. Isaac was carrying grief and guilt over unresolved conflict with someone who died. Strauss was carrying something that the mind has even fewer resources for processing. He killed his wife and young son. He was in a full psychotic state when it happened, driven by marker-induced dementia to the point where he believed they were necromorphs. The act was committed in a state that, by any meaningful clinical standard, represents a complete break from reality. He genuinely could not distinguish his family from the entities he believed were attacking him. When his rational mind began returning in fragments over time, it found something that could not be integrated: the psychological literature on what happens when a person commits an act during a psychotic state and then recovers enough lucidity to become aware of what they did, describes a process that has no clean clinical resolution. The psychosis is real, the break was genuine, The person in the acute psychotic state was not making a choice in any meaningful sense of that word, but the outcome of the psychotic act is still real. The people who died are still gone, and the part of the person's mind that has returned to something like coherence has to find some way to hold that fact. Strauss found a way by not holding it at all. He constructed an internal narrative in which his wife and son were safe, in which he had saved them from necromorphs, in which what he had done was not the thing he had actually done. When questioned in the facility about what had happened, he was unable to recount the incident in detail. His responses when the subject came up were withdrawal and disconnection, the behavioral signatures of a mind that has placed a partition around material it cannot process without fragmenting. He spoke of his wife and son in ways that implied they were alive. When his hallucinations of them began on Titan Station during the outbreak, he spoke to them as though they were present. This is not deception. This is a form of dissociative coping that the clinical literature has documented in cases of extreme guilt and shame following acts committed in compromised states. The person does not consciously choose to believe the alternative narrative. The alternative narrative presents itself as protection, because the accurate narrative is more than the currently available cognitive and emotional architecture can withstand. The partition holds not because the person is in denial in any simple sense, but because the mind has found that the accurate version cannot be processed without collapse, and collapse cannot be allowed, so the partition becomes structural. Strauss maintained this partition for long enough that it became part of the operating architecture of his mind on Titan Station. He helped Isaac. He communicated through video feeds. He proposed strategies for destroying the marker. There were moments in the early stages of the outbreak where he was genuinely functional in ways that were meaningful for the survival of the people around him. His own assessment of his deteriorating state, his warning that time was running out for both of them, represents a degree of lucidity that Isaac, suppressed under memory-blocking agents, was not always able to access. But the marker was not interested in maintaining Strauss's partition. The hallucinations that came for Strauss on Titan Station did not take the form that his own grief-coping mechanism would have chosen for him. If his internal dissociative system had been generating the hallucinations, they would have presented his wife and son as alive and safe, consistent with the fiction he had constructed. The marker's hallucinations presented them differently. They showed him faces with empty, gouged eyes, decorations bearing messages his guilt had written for itself, messages about being dead inside, about what kind of father leaves his family. The hallucinations of his wife and son did not comfort him. They confronted him. They forced his attention toward the thing the partition had been holding at bay. The marker was dismantling Strauss's coping mechanism in the same way it had built Isaac's. For the same reason, it needed him to do something. In Strauss's case, the marker needed him moving through specific steps toward the Noonlight diagnostics machine. The steps he compulsively recited, which his fractured mind had encoded and returned to like a broken record, were the marker's instructions expressed through his deteriorating mind as a loop his conscious mind could not silence or escape. Hypergraphia and its vocal equivalent, the compulsive repetition of encoded marker content, represents the signal's most direct form of behavioral control, the installation of an internal compulsion that functions with the force of a biological drive. Strauss could not stop reciting the steps the way a person in the grip of obsessive-compulsive disorder cannot stop performing a compulsion. The repetition feels urgent, feels necessary. The mind cannot set it down. What happened to Strauss represents the most targeted example in the Dead Space franchise of the marker weaponizing a specific type of guilt rather than grief. Isaac's experience was built on the grief of loss and the guilt of unresolved conflict. Kyne's was built on the grief of long absence. Strauss's was built on the guilt of an act that could not be undone, could not be reconciled, and could not be safely faced by the architecture of the mind that had committed it. The marker found the one thing Strauss could not look at directly, and placed it in his field of vision constantly. His hallucinations became a sustained confrontation with the worst thing he had ever done, delivered through the faces of the people he had done it to. The dissociative partition, which had been protecting him, collapsed progressively under this sustained pressure. and as it collapsed, his ability to manage his own behavior collapsed with it. The attack on Ellie, where he gouged out her eye, represents the terminal stage of this trajectory. The compulsion the marker had installed, the sequence of steps he could not stop reciting, involved specific actions that his deteriorating mind could no longer resist carrying out, even in the presence of people who were, by any measure, on his side. He was not choosing to hurt Ellie. He was performing an act his fractured mind had been directed toward by a signal he could not resist, in a state where the partition between his own volition and the marker's installed compulsion had dissolved. In the clinical literature on command hallucinations, which are hallucinations that issue direct behavioral instructions to the person experiencing them, researchers have documented that the compliance rates with command hallucinations are highest when the commands align with existing beliefs, fears, or compulsive patterns, and when the person experiencing them is in a state of severe distress with depleted self-regulatory resources. Strauss, by the time he attacked Ellie, was in exactly that state, deeply distressed, his coping structure dismantled by sustained exposure to the very material it had been protecting him from, and operating under a compulsive instruction sequence that his voluntary control could no longer override. He is the case study in what happens when the marker finds a guilt wound rather than a grief wound. Isaac's grief kept him functional long enough to serve the marker's purposes. Strauss's guilt consumed him past the point of function in ways the marker was entirely willing to allow, because what the marker needed from Strauss was not sustained functionality, but a specific sequence of actions that the deteriorating remnant of his cognition could still deliver. The comparison between the two trajectories illuminates something important. The marker does not care about the people it uses, it cares about what it can get them to do, and its calibration of how much to sustain and how much to destroy is determined entirely by what it needs from each individual, not by anything about who they are or what they deserve. Isaac survived. Strauss didn't. The difference was not resilience or character. The difference was which of them the marker had decided to use more carefully. That distinction is worth sitting with, because the next part of this story is going to take us somewhere that most analyses of Dead Space never quite reach. We've looked at individual minds being broken in specific, personalized ways, but Dead Space doesn't just break individuals. There are entire communities in this franchise whose collective psychology fractures along the lines the marker finds, and the picture that emerges from those collective breakdowns is more disturbing in some ways than anything a single character could produce. What happened to the Aegis VII colony was not the random horror it appeared to be on the surface. It was the result of a signal that understood, with machine precision, how communities fall apart, and then created the exact conditions required for that specific community's specific collapse. And the piece of that picture nobody usually focuses on is the piece that changes how you understand everything that follows it. Chapter 8. A colony loses everything. The Aegis VII colony's breakdown is usually treated as background, as setup, the thing that happened before Isaac arrived, the context for the horror rather than the horror itself. Most analyses of Dead Space treat the colony the way a disaster report treats the structural conditions that preceded the event: necessary context, then past it. That is the wrong way to look at it. What happened to the Aegis VII colonists is one of the most psychologically detailed and clinically relevant sequences in the franchise, and it deserves examination on its own terms rather than as a prelude to something else. Because the colony's collapse follows a progression that maps onto real research about how psychological deterioration spreads through communities in ways that are specific, predictable, and preventable. The marker didn't use random violence to take apart Aegis VII. It used a sequence. The sequence began with sleep. Insomnia is the first documented symptom across the colony, not the dramatic insomnia of someone lying awake with identifiable worries, turning specific fears over in the darkness. The insomnia reported in the early stages of marker exposure is characterized by a particular quality: the inability to sleep despite exhaustion, accompanied by nightmares when sleep does briefly come, and a growing sense that the waking hours themselves no longer feel entirely real. The quality of perception deteriorates, attention fractures, tasks that were routine become difficult to track through to completion. What this does to a working community, particularly one engaged in the kind of precision-dependent industrial work that planet cracking requires, is create a cascading series of failures. Decisions get made by people operating at significantly reduced cognitive capacity. Safety protocols get missed. Equipment malfunctions that would ordinarily be caught in time don't get caught. Interpersonal conflicts that would ordinarily be managed by people with adequate sleep and functional emotional regulation escalate instead. The community, without yet understanding why, begins to function at a diminished level, and the experience of functioning badly in conditions where functioning well is a survival requirement generates its own secondary anxiety, the fear of error, the awareness that something is wrong, the inability to identify the cause. This secondary anxiety is not a response to an imagined threat. The community's instinct that something is wrong is accurate. Something is wrong. The problem is that the actual cause of the wrongness is invisible, which means the anxiety about it has nowhere to land except on the most available targets: colleagues, supervisors, working conditions, the colony's management, whoever represents authority in the immediate environment. The interpersonal fabric of the community begins to tear along these lines before the marker's signal has produced a single hallucination. The research on what's called social contagion of distress, the spread of psychological states through communities by observational and social mechanisms rather than purely biological ones, is relevant here. Communities under shared stress develop shared emotional climates that are not simply the sum of individual emotional states. When enough people in a closed environment are experiencing anxiety, poor sleep, and reduced cognitive functioning, the social environment itself becomes a carrier of those states. People who might have been more resistant to the marker's direct effects are reached by the effects of the community's response to the marker's effects. The breakdown spreads through social channels, even as it spreads through neurological ones. Sam Caldwell was a maintenance worker on Aegis VII. His documented experience represents one of the most complete individual case studies in how the marker's signal progresses from early disruption to complete psychotic break in a person who was not, by any available account, mentally ill before marker contact. By the time his experience was documented, he had begun to perceive his fellow miners as monsters, not metaphorically. The signal had so thoroughly altered his visual processing that the people around him appeared to him as threats, as creatures, as things that were coming for him. His response was to act on what he perceived. He believed with complete and genuine certainty that he was defending himself. The killing spree that resulted was experienced by Sam Caldwell as survival. He was not a violent person who became violent. He was an ordinary person whose perceptual architecture had been so thoroughly rewritten by the marker's signal that the targets of his violence were invisible to him. He could not see what was actually there. He was not choosing to ignore it. The capacity to see it had been removed. This is the clinical picture of a full psychotic break with prominent visual hallucinations, a state in which the person's experience of reality has been replaced by a construction they cannot distinguish from the real. In real-world clinical contexts, this presentation is most commonly associated with the acute phase of conditions like schizophrenia, brief psychotic disorder, or organic psychosis produced by various causes, including certain substances, neurological events, and extreme psychological stress. The treatment for someone in this state focuses on establishing safety and then addressing the biological disruption, typically through antipsychotic medication and supportive care. Sam Caldwell received none of this. By the time his state reached the level that made him dangerous, the colony's situation had already deteriorated past the point where any organized response was possible. There was no one in a position to restrain him safely. No medication available in the context of a colony being actively torn apart. No structure within which even the most well-trained person could have provided meaningful intervention. This is another dimension of the Aegis VII tragedy that the game's horror framing tends to obscure. The colonists who became dangerous were not transformed into their danger by some simple biological process with no intermediate steps. They passed through stages that, in a functional support environment, would have been recognizable as warning signs. The insomnia stage, the anxiety and conflict stage, the early paranoia and social withdrawal stage. At each of these points, in a different context, intervention would have been possible. Care would have made a difference. The marker signal was effective at Aegis VII, partly because the signal itself disrupted cognition and perception, but it was also effective because the context, an isolated industrial colony far from any meaningful medical support, had no architecture for recognizing and responding to psychological deterioration in its population. There was no one trained to identify the early stages, no system for aggregating individual reports of sleep difficulty and mood change into the pattern that would have identified a community-wide problem, no protocol for what to do if a significant portion of the workforce began experiencing psychological symptoms simultaneously. The absence of that architecture is not specific to science fiction. Research on occupational psychological health in isolated industrial environments, including offshore drilling operations, Antarctic research stations, submarine crews, and mining operations in remote locations, consistently identifies the same structural vulnerabilities. The difficulty of maintaining mental health support in contexts where help-seeking is stigmatized, where the workforce is selected for toughness, where the environment provides limited privacy and limited outlets, and where there is genuine social and professional pressure to present as functional, regardless of actual state. The Aegis VII colony was operating in exactly this environment. The marker found it there, and what it found was a community that had almost no capacity to recognize or respond to what was happening to itself. The result was not chaos in the sense of randomness. The breakdown followed the sequence the signal was designed to produce: sleep disruption weakening cognitive defenses, anxiety and interpersonal conflict fracturing social cohesion, paranoia and violence creating the corpses the marker needed, and running beneath all of it, in the individuals the signal had identified as compatible, the specific and personal hallucinations that would be used for more complex purposes. By the time the Ishimura arrived to retrieve the marker, the colony below had been systematically prepared for exactly the catastrophe that followed. Prepared not in the sense of a plan anyone had articulated or consented to, prepared in the sense that every defense had been removed, one by one, in the order most efficient for what the marker required. The colonists were not casualties, they were the mechanism, and the man who arrived to oversee the marker's retrieval, in a ship staffed by people who were already beginning to experience the signal's early effects from the artifact sitting in the cargo bay, had been given absolutely no way to understand what he was walking into, because the institution he represented had decided it wasn't necessary for him to understand that. Chapter 9. Carver Carries His Dead. John Carver is the character in Dead Space who most clearly demonstrates the difference between grief and guilt as entry points for the marker's signal. Isaac Clarke's marker-induced breakdown was built on grief. The loss of Nicole, the unresolved conflict, the desperate need for repair. Nolan Strauss's breakdown was built on guilt, the unbearable knowledge of what he had done in his psychotic state and the partition his mind had built to keep him from having to face it. Carver's breakdown is built on a specific combination that has its own clinical character: survivor's guilt compounded by a sense of protective failure, operating in a person who is already functioning in a high-stress military role, and managing emotions in the way that environment requires, which is to say, managing them by not engaging with them. His wife Damara was a data analyst stationed on Uxor, studying the marker there. His son Dylan was with her. When Jacob Danik's circle removed the marker's containment shroud on Uxor, the resulting outbreak killed both of them. Carver was not there when it happened. He was doing the work his role required him to do, and the people he was supposed to protect were in a place he couldn't reach in time. This specific configuration, being absent at the moment of loss, unable to intervene, having the role of protector, and having failed that role through circumstance rather than through any identifiable personal failure, is one of the most psychologically difficult forms of loss to process. The guilt it produces is particularly resistant to resolution because it is technically irrational. Carver could not have been in two places at once. There was no action available to him at the moment of his family's deaths that he failed to take. His absence was not negligence, and yet the mind does not process the logic of this the way logic would prefer. The emotional mind runs its own calculations, and those calculations produce guilt based on outcome rather than on what was actually within anyone's control. Survivor's guilt, in the clinical literature, describes exactly this: the specific guilt experienced by people who survive events in which others, particularly people they were responsible for or deeply attached to, did not. It is well documented in veterans, in survivors of mass violence, in people who escaped accidents in which family members died, and in many other contexts where survival carries the implicit weight of having lived when others didn't. The irrationality of the guilt does not reduce its force. It amplifies it, because there is no available action that can address the guilt by correcting the situation that caused it. You cannot earn your way out of survival guilt by doing something right, the way you can earn your way out of guilt over a specific wrongful act by making amends. There is nothing to make amends for. There is only the fact of your survival and the absence of the people who didn't survive. Carver carries this into Dead Space 3 and into his contact with the markers at Tau Volantis. The marker finds it immediately. The hallucinations it builds for Carver are drawn from the specific emotional content of his guilt, rather than from grief in its simpler form. The difference is visible in the texture of what he sees. Isaac's Nicole, at least in the first game, was warm and guiding, built from a relationship that was loving even if it was strained. Carver's Damara appears bloodied and cold on the surface of Tau Volantis, walking away from him in the distance. She does not guide, she recedes. She is always somewhere he has just failed to reach in time. The hallucinations he experiences in the archaeology warehouse are the most psychologically specific moments in the game. Decorations cover the walls, the kind of birthday celebration decorations you would put up for a child's party. But the messages on them are not celebration. They are guilt, rendered in a child's handwriting. Messages that say he is dead inside. Messages that say like father, like son. A photograph of Damara and Dylan on the wall. The image disfigured, their eyes gouged out and bleeding. The warehouse is a recreation of his worst self-image as a father and husband, assembled from the things that would have been symbols of connection and love, and converted into evidence of his failure. This is exactly how guilt-based hallucinations differ from grief-based ones. Grief reaches for what was lost and tries to maintain it. Guilt reaches for the evidence of failure and keeps presenting it. The marker, reading Carver, understood what his specific wound contained and built hallucinations that operated through it rather than around it. It did not give him a comforting vision of Damara pointing the way. It gave him the accusatory version, the one that confirmed the fear he most needed not to be true, and presented it in the environment most likely to make it feel like verdict rather than fear. The clinical concept of hypervigilance is relevant to understanding Carver's overall functioning throughout Dead Space 3. PTSD's hypervigilance component describes a state of sustained alertness to threat, a physiological and psychological state in which the nervous system operates as though danger is always imminent, and the body must remain ready to respond. For someone carrying the trauma of having lost his family in a sudden necromorph outbreak, the ongoing environment of Dead Space 3, another necromorph outbreak in another hostile location with another set of people in danger, provides constant activation for the hypervigilance response. There is no moment of genuine safety. The nervous system never gets to downregulate. What this means in practical terms is that Carver is operating throughout Dead Space 3 from a physiological baseline of stress that would be unsustainable in most civilian contexts. His emotional responses are compressed. His empathy, while present, is operating under conditions of significant suppression because the emotional engagement that empathy requires is incompatible with the kind of sustained tactical vigilance the situation demands. He presents as cold and abrasive in his early interactions with Isaac and the others precisely because he is managing the psychological load of his grief and guilt by converting it into forward momentum and operational focus. He is doing what military training prepares people to do with emotional content, setting it aside and functioning. The marker dismantles this strategy by making the emotional content unavoidable. What Carver eventually does, in the sequence where the marker pulls him into the dementia land that resembles his family home, is face the accumulated weight of everything he has been pushing past. The marker constructs a version of Damara who tells him he has nothing left to live for. No wife, no son, no soul, no reason to continue. It presents the case for his own surrender with his dead wife's voice, drawing on the specific emotional logic of survivor's guilt to make the argument feel true. He defeats it. The clinical language for what he does is something like successful emotional confrontation of traumatic material, the ability to engage with the feared content directly without the collapse of functioning that the avoidance strategy was designed to prevent. This does not mean Carver stops grieving. It means he finds a way to hold the grief and continue anyway. That he can do this while also facing down a hallucination the marker built specifically from his worst fears about himself says something about the resilience that can exist in even the most damaged psychology. It also raises a question the franchise leaves open. Isaac's hallucinations were authored by the marker with specific goals in mind. Were Carver's equally authored, or did the marker, in Carver's case, simply find the wound and let his own guilt do the rest? The distinction matters because it determines whether Carver's confrontation of the hallucinations was a psychological achievement or another step in a sequence the marker was running on him all along. The franchise doesn't answer this cleanly, and that ambiguity is part of what makes Carver the most interesting psychological case study in Dead Space 3, in the space between what the marker authors and what the person themselves generates. Before we examine the man who led the faction responsible for Damara and Dylan Carver's deaths, there is one more thing worth noting about Carver's psychology that connects directly to the chapter coming up. Jacob Danik believed he was doing something sacred when he removed the marker shrouds. He believed the deaths that followed were not tragedy but transition. He had a complete theological framework that absorbed the evidence of mass death and processed it as confirmation rather than contradiction. Understanding why someone like Danik believes what he believes requires a different psychological framework than the one that explains what the marker does to minds directly. Danik was not hallucinating. His mind was not broken by the signal. He was functioning cognitively in ways that passed every ordinary test for rational belief formation, and he still ended the world. Chapter 10. Danik believes the fire. Jacob Danik is, in clinical terms, the least obviously disordered major character in Dead Space. He is not experiencing hallucinations. He has not been driven into violent paranoia by the marker's signal. He is not in a dissociative state, not experiencing command hallucinations, not operating from inside a psychotic break. He can hold a coherent conversation. He can plan operations. He can lead people. He can evaluate tactical situations and make decisions. He is, by many external measures, the most functionally rational person in Dead Space 3's story. He is also, by the end, the person most directly responsible for the deaths of the largest number of people in the franchise. Understanding how this is possible, how someone can be cognitively intact and still lead a systematic campaign of destruction while genuinely believing they are serving humanity's highest good, requires a framework different from the clinical one. It requires the psychology of belief. The early 20th century writer Eric Hoffer, in his study of mass movements and the psychology of people who devote themselves completely to ideological causes, identified what he called the true believer, a person whose primary psychological orientation has become not toward any particular cause itself, but toward the experience of absolute certainty about a cause. The specific content of the belief matters less than its function, which is to replace the unbearable condition of personal uncertainty and meaninglessness with the unassailable condition of belonging to something larger than the self, something that provides complete answers to all questions about what is right and what is necessary. Danik fits this profile with considerable precision. His association with Unitology goes back far enough that he was known to Isaac's mother before her death. His commitment to the Church of Unitology was comprehensive enough to qualify as the central organizing principle of his identity, and crucially, he had access to information about the markers that most Unitologists did not. He understood to a degree that exceeds simple belief that the markers were not simply divine artifacts. He had knowledge of their actual function, of what convergence would physically entail. This is the psychologically specific element of Danik that the franchise handles with surprising sophistication. He was not simply ignorant of the evidence Isaac kept presenting to him. He was resistant to it in a way that the clinical and social psychology literature has studied extensively under the term motivated reasoning. Motivated reasoning describes the cognitive mechanism by which pre-existing beliefs influence the processing of new information, not through conscious selection of what to believe, but through unconscious filtering that happens earlier in the evaluative process. When a person encounters information that confirms an existing belief, the cognitive system generates less scrutiny, accepts it more readily, and stores it more accessibly for future retrieval. When information arrives that contradicts an existing belief, the cognitive system generates more scrutiny, finds more potential objections, and tends to conclude that the information is unreliable. The process is not lying to oneself in any deliberate sense. It is the automatic operation of a cognitive system that has learned to protect the belief from the cost of revising it. For Danik, the cost of revising his belief in convergence would not be merely intellectual. His entire identity, his purpose, his community, his relationship to the deaths he had caused and overseen, all of this was organized around the belief that convergence was real, that it was sacred, and that the deaths necessary to achieve it were meaningful. Revising the belief would not simply require updating a fact. It would require dismantling the framework that had given his entire adult life and the deaths he was responsible for their meaning. The human mind has a significant capacity for resisting revisions of that magnitude. This is not a character flaw specific to Danik. It is a feature of how belief systems interact with identity. The stronger the integration of a belief into a person's sense of who they are and what their life has meant, the more the cognitive system will work to protect that belief from incoming information that would require it to be revised. Religious beliefs are particularly susceptible to this dynamic precisely because they tend to be deeply integrated into identity, and because they offer frameworks that can absorb contradictory evidence within their own terms. When Isaac told Danik what the Brethren Moons actually were, what they actually intended, what convergence would actually look like for humanity, Danik's motivated reasoning had a framework ready for each piece of information: fear of the unknown, misinterpretation, the limited perspective of someone who could not see what Danik could see from within the faith. Each piece of evidence was processed through the belief rather than being allowed to challenge it. This is not, it should be said, a pattern exclusive to religious belief. It appears in political ideology, in professional certainties, in any domain where a belief has become load-bearing for a person's sense of identity and purpose. The specific example of Danik is religious, but the mechanism generalizes to any context where a person has enough at stake in a belief that revising it would feel like losing themselves, rather than simply updating a position. The specific feature that makes apocalyptic belief systems particularly powerful as identity anchors is what psychologists who study existential motivation call terror management. This framework, developed from Ernest Becker's work on the denial of death, proposes that much of human motivation is organized around the management of anxiety about mortality, the awareness that we will die, that the things we have built will end, that meaning we have found is contingent on the limited duration of our lives. Belief systems that offer transcendence of individual death, frameworks in which the self is absorbed into something that continues beyond any individual existence, are particularly effective at resolving this anxiety. They do not require you to not be afraid of death. They offer you a reason to welcome it. Unitology's doctrine of convergence does exactly this. It promises not merely that convergence will happen, but that those who participate in bringing it about will become part of something that transcends biological individual existence. The death is not a cost, the death is the point. And a belief system structured this way is almost completely resistant to the standard argument against it, which is that the deaths it causes are too high a price. For someone who has fully internalized the framework, the deaths are the path to what the framework promises. The argument that they're too high a price presupposes that survival is the goal, which the framework has already resolved by redefining the terms. Danek's calm in the presence of evidence that would have collapsed a different person's certainty, his ability to watch mass death and read it as confirmation rather than contradiction, his willingness to sacrifice his own life in pursuit of convergence, all of these emerge from a belief system so thoroughly integrated into his identity that it had become indistinguishable from his sense of himself. He was not broken by the marker. He was not manipulated by a hallucination. He was simply a person who had organized his entire psychology around a belief that happened to be catastrophically wrong, and who had no available mechanism for revising that belief because revising it would have meant losing everything. Keep this picture of Danek in mind, because the institution that built him, the one that offered the belief system he organized himself around and then spent generations selecting for exactly the kind of committed, certain, unrevising believer he became, that institution is the final character we need to examine, and what Dead Space reveals about that institution, particularly in its later stages, is something the franchise rarely gets credit for noticing. Because the Church of Unitology is not simply a context for the game's villains, it is itself a case study in a specific kind of psychological phenomenon, the kind that the research on high-control religious groups has been documenting for decades, the kind that takes ordinary people with ordinary fears about death and meaning and turns them into the condition for the catastrophe. And the piece of this nobody usually talks about is the way the church worked on its members long before any of them ever got close to a marker. Chapter 11. The Church Eats Itself. The Church of Unitology is presented in Dead Space as a doomsday cult dressed in the language of legitimate religion, and this framing is accurate as far as it goes, but it undersells what the franchise is doing with the institution, because Unitology is not just a plot device for explaining why so many characters are doing irrational things. It is a functioning portrait of how a certain kind of belief system operates on human psychology, and the portrait is specific enough to be recognizable to anyone who has studied the literature on high-control religious organizations. The doctrine of Unitology has particular appeal to a specific type of grief. It promises that human consciousness does not end at biological death. It promises that the markers, the artifacts around which the faith is organized, are the means by which humanity will achieve a form of unity that transcends individual existence. It frames the biological death of the body not as termination but as transition, and it provides a community of people who share this framework and the specific emotional comfort it provides. For someone who has lost a person they loved, particularly someone who has lost them suddenly and without preparation, and who finds themselves unable to integrate the loss within a purely secular framework where death is simply an ending, Unitology's doctrine offers something almost irresistible. The person who was lost is not simply gone. They are somewhere in the process that Unitology describes. The loss is meaningful within a larger pattern. The grief has a framework around it. This is precisely the emotional terrain in which high-control religious groups most reliably recruit. Research on exit counseling and the psychological dynamics of cult membership consistently identifies grief, recent loss, life transition, and the experience of meaning vacuum as the conditions most associated with vulnerability to high-control group recruitment. People are not recruited into these groups because they are stupid or weak. They are recruited because the groups offer something real: community, explanation, the management of death anxiety, the sense of belonging to something larger than oneself. These are genuine psychological needs. The problem is not the need. The problem is what the group requires in exchange for meeting it. The BITE model, developed by researcher Stephen Hassan, describes the mechanism of high-control group influence in terms of 4 dimensions of control: behavior, information, thought, and emotional control. Behavioral control refers to the regulation of members' activities and physical environment. Information control refers to the management of what information members can access, who they can speak with about it, and how it can be interpreted. Thought control refers to the installation of specific internal language and thought-stopping techniques that make it difficult to think critically about the group's teachings. Emotional control refers to the manipulation of emotional states to maintain commitment. typically alternating between the experience of love, belonging, and elevation within the group, and the experience of shame, fear, and isolation when doubt or dissent is expressed. Unitology fits this framework across all four dimensions. The financial structure of the church, which requires progressively higher fees for access to higher levels of membership and teaching, functions as a behavioral control mechanism. The investment of material resources creates psychological commitment to the belief system that justifies the investment. The church's relationship to information about the markers is tightly controlled at every level, with the scientific information about what the artifacts actually do being inaccessible to ordinary members and even to highly committed members like Kine, who spent his career studying the limited documentation that had survived from the discovery of the red marker. The internal language of Unitology, with its specific terms for the convergence and for the stages of spiritual development, functions as a thought control mechanism that makes it difficult to think about the religion's premises in terms that would allow critical evaluation, and the emotional dynamics of belonging to a community that promises transcendence of death, alternating with the shame and social consequences of doubt or departure, maintain the emotional investment of members. This is not unique to Unitology. It is the structural template of high-control religious organizations across the spectrum of religious traditions. What makes Unitology's specific application of this template particularly relevant to Dead Space is the way the franchise traces what happens to a high-control organization when the thing it has been promising turns out to be real, but real in a way that contradicts everything it has claimed about what the promise means. The Unitologist cult that forms in Dead Space 3, Awakened, represents the endpoint of what Unitology's belief system was always pointing toward, pushed past every remaining restraint by the combined pressure of Danik's death, the evidence of Convergence's actual character provided by the necromorph outbreak on Tau Volantis, and the contact with the Brother Moons that followed. What the surviving members of the Circle experienced when the moons reached them was contact with something genuinely massive, genuinely alien, and entirely outside the theological category Unitology had prepared them to encounter. The doctrine had promised convergence as a kind of elevation, an ascension, something sacred and beautiful at the end of the process the church had been serving. What they encountered was appetite, not divinity, something that was hungry and enormous, and had been waiting for humanity to remove its own defenses. For some of them, this contact was immediately destabilizing in the most complete possible way. Several members simply began repeating that they were coming and they were hungry, reduced by the contact to a single phrase that absorbed all available cognitive functioning. Others ended their own lives. The ones who didn't, the ones who found a way to absorb even this into their belief system, are the case study in what psychology researchers call belief perseverance, the documented tendency for beliefs to maintain their force, even after the evidence that originally supported them has been discredited or revealed to be something other than what was believed. In laboratory studies, people who were given evidence for a belief and then told the evidence was fabricated continued to hold the belief at higher levels than people who were never given the fabricated evidence at all. The emotional investment in a belief, once made, persists past the logical basis for it. The surviving Unitologists who formed the cult on the CMS Terra Nova had made investments in the belief in convergence that encompassed their entire identity, every meaningful relationship in their lives, their understanding of their own history and purpose, and in many cases their willingness to commit violence in the belief's service. The revelation that convergence was not what they had believed it to be was not a piece of information that could simply update their position. It was a complete dissolution of every framework they had for understanding who they were and what their lives had meant. The cult's response was to build a new framework around the dissolution, to declare Danik a saint, to reconstruct the theology around the moon's actual hunger rather than the doctrine's promised elevation, to interpret the nightmare they had witnessed not as evidence against the faith, but as its consummation in a form they had not been prepared to recognize. They began mutilating themselves to resemble necromorphs, offering parts of their bodies to the moons, reinterpreting the horror of what convergence actually meant as the test of faith that only the truly committed could endure. This escalation towards self-destruction is documented in the literature on apocalyptic movements that have faced the failure of their central prediction. When the promised event does not occur, or occurs in a form that contradicts the promise, the psychological cost of abandoning the belief is in many cases higher than the cost of reinterpreting the event within the belief's framework. The movement does not simply disband, it transforms. In some documented historical cases, the transformation has involved increasingly extreme behavior, including self-destructive acts, as the group attempts to demonstrate the depth of its commitment as evidence that the prediction was right in some form the initial believers hadn't fully understood. The Unitologist cult is the most extreme endpoint of this pattern in the Dead Space franchise. It is also the logical conclusion of what Unitology always was, a system designed to convert mortality fear into commitment to a cause that promises to transcend mortality, operating on people who needed that conversion badly enough to give everything for it. The franchise is, in these later stages, making a point about institutions and what they do to the people they claim to serve. Unitology did not make its members stronger. It organized their most fundamental anxieties into a vehicle for their own destruction, and then called the vehicle divine. The marker didn't need to do much to the true believers. The institution had already done most of the work. This brings us to the question that has been building since the beginning of this script. We have looked at individual psychological breakdowns, collective ones, ideological ones, and institutional ones. We have watched the marker find wounds in miners and scientists and captains and soldiers and grief-stricken engineers. We have seen what it built from each of those wounds and what the building cost each person. What we haven't fully examined is what it cost Isaac Clarke specifically. Not in the first game, but in the 3 years between Dead Space and Dead Space 2, because what EarthGov did to Isaac in the aftermath of the Ishimura is the franchise's most direct statement about the relationship between trauma and the institutions that should help people recover from it. And it is, in some ways, the most harrowing chapter in this story, because the marker didn't author it, people did. Chapter 12. 3 Years in the Dark. Isaac Clarke survived the Ishimura. That sentence seems like the starting point for a recovery story. Someone who went through something catastrophic and came out the other side. The kind of arc that, in most narratives, leads toward healing, grief eventually processed, trauma acknowledged, support gradually rebuilding the capacity to function. Most narratives would give Isaac some version of that. Dead Space 2 opens on a different premise entirely. He was recovered by EarthGov. His shuttle, drifting after the events on Aegis VII, was found and taken to Titan Station. He was placed in the psychiatric ward of Titan Memorial Medical Center. He was diagnosed with PTSD and marker-induced dementia. He was given a patient number, Patient 4. Nolan Strauss was Patient 5. Their minds, imprinted with marker blueprints by the signal from Marker 2A on Aegis VII, were the most valuable things EarthGov had encountered in its attempts to understand the artifacts. And for 3 years, EarthGov did not attempt to treat what was wrong with Isaac Clarke. It attempted to extract what was inside his mind. The Noonlight diagnostics machine accessed the marker-imprinted regions of his brain through a method that, even within the context of a science fiction universe, is viscerally specific in its violation. A needle, inserted through the eye into the brain, stimulating the marker-touch neural architecture to release the encoded information. After each session, memory suppressants were administered. The suppressants erased Isaac's knowledge of what had just been done to him, erased his awareness of the sessions, and kept his dementia in a state of partial suppression. Not treatment, management. The difference between those two things is the difference between trying to help a person recover and trying to keep a damaged mechanism functional enough to keep generating useful output. Isaac woke up at the start of Dead Space 2 with no memory of the 3 years he had spent in the facility. 3 years of his life gone. 3 years during which every session of the Noonlight diagnostics machine was erased from his accessible memory by the suppressants. 3 years during which the institution responsible for his care had decided that his trauma was more valuable as a resource than his recovery was as an outcome. Take that premise and hold it alongside the clinical reality of PTSD. because the gap between what Isaac needed and what he received is the specific horror Dead Space 2 is building its second game around. Post-traumatic stress disorder, in the clinical literature, is well understood as a condition that responds to treatment. The evidence base for therapeutic approaches, particularly trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy and EMDR, has accumulated over decades of study and is robust enough to give clinicians meaningful confidence in treatment outcomes. PTSD is not untreatable. People who receive appropriate, evidence-based care following traumatic events improve, not always quickly, not without significant effort and support, but the trajectory of treated PTSD, for the majority of people, moves toward integration of the traumatic experience rather than perpetual acute distress. The key word in that framework is treatment, and the key element of effective trauma treatment is memory. The gradual, supported processing of the traumatic material in a context where the person has enough safety and therapeutic support to access the memory without being re-traumatized by it. Trauma-focused therapies work by helping the person approach the memory of what happened in a way that allows it to be integrated into their broader autobiographical narrative, rather than remaining a partitioned, unprocessed fragment that continues to generate acute distress. Memory suppressants do the opposite of this. By chemically blocking access to traumatic memory, the suppressants prevented any processing from occurring. The traumatic material was not being integrated. It was being held at a distance, kept just below the threshold where it would have manifested as active symptoms severe enough to interfere with the facility's ability to extract information. This is not a therapeutic intervention. It is a management strategy for an asset that the institution needed to remain in a specific, exploitable state. Isaac's PTSD across those 3 years was not healing. Without processing, without the relational support and therapeutic context that trauma treatment requires, without even the basic ability to acknowledge what had happened on the Ishimura, the traumatic experience was sitting in exactly the state that perpetuates PTSD, unprocessed, unintegrated, accessible enough to generate ongoing distress, but suppressed enough to prevent the active engagement with the material that might have allowed it to resolve. The dementia diagnosis is equally significant. Within the Dead Space lore, the dementia designation describes the cognitive and perceptual deterioration produced by marker imprinting, rather than the clinical condition most people associate with that word. But the treatment Isaac received for it maps onto a real pattern documented in the medical ethics literature on research involving cognitively impaired individuals. Individuals whose cognitive functioning has been compromised by any cause are considered a particularly vulnerable population in research contexts, and the ethical standards governing research involving such individuals are correspondingly strict. The informed consent requirements, the standards for what constitutes a genuine benefit to the participant, the protections against exploitation of impaired cognition for institutional benefit. EarthGov classified Isaac as Patient 4, not as a person with a name and a history and a set of rights that his psychiatric condition required protecting rather than bypassing, as a patient number, as a subject in a research program. The dementia designation, rather than triggering the additional protections that ethical research standards would require for a cognitively impaired individual, seems to have served primarily as a justification for the suppressants that kept the subject manageable. The parallel to the Murkoff Corporation's treatment of Mount Massive's psychiatric patients in the Outlast franchise is not accidental. The specific horror of institutions that use the language of care to conceal the practice of exploitation is one that appears across multiple horror franchises because it reflects something real about the relationship between vulnerable people and the systems that ostensibly exist to protect them. The language of medicine, of treatment, of care, is used by EarthGov throughout the Project Telomere documentation to frame what is happening to Isaac and to the other patients as something that serves their interests. The reality of what is happening to them, the procedures, the suppressants, the extraction, the patient numbers rather than names, tells a different story. There is something particularly targeted in the horror of using memory suppression on a trauma survivor. Memory is not incidental to the experience of trauma. It is the core of what PTSD is. a condition in which the mind cannot process and integrate a memory in the normal way, and that failure of integration generates ongoing suffering. Taking someone in that condition, performing invasive procedures on the neural architecture that carries the traumatic imprint, then erasing their awareness of those procedures, is a violation that compounds the original trauma with a specifically medical betrayal. The institution that should be helping is instead using the injury, and Isaac knew none of this when he woke up. When the necromorph outbreak began on Titan Station, Franco, the protagonist of the animated prequel, released Isaac from the psych ward before being killed by a necromorph. Isaac woke confused, with no accessible memory of the previous 3 years, still experiencing the Nicole hallucination, still carrying the PTSD that 3 years of institutional exploitation had prevented from healing, and still imprinted with the marker blueprint that EarthGov had spent 3 years extracting from his mind, without his knowledge or consent. The 3 years had not made him stronger. They had made him exactly as damaged as he had been when he arrived, but with an additional layer of institutional betrayal he didn't yet know to account for. Here is the part of Isaac's story that changes the entire framework of Dead Space 2, and that almost nobody talks about with the specific attention it deserves: the marker on Titan Station. The Site-12 marker, the gigantic artifact built in the Sproul under Hans Tiedeman's supervision, was built from Isaac's mind. The blueprints extracted through 3 years of sessions in the Titan Memorial Medical Center were the foundation of the Site-12 marker's construction. The necromorph outbreak on the Sprawl that kills hundreds of thousands of people, the outbreak that Isaac spends the entirety of Dead Space 2 trying to stop, was caused by an artifact that EarthGov built from the damage the marker on Aegis VII did to Isaac Clarke's brain. EarthGov did not break Isaac the way the marker broke the colonists, but EarthGov used the damage the marker caused to build something that broke everyone else. The specific psychology of that revelation, when Isaac processes it, sits in a category that the clinical literature on institutional trauma recognizes as particularly difficult to integrate. Institutional trauma refers to the specific psychological damage caused by harm at the hands of institutions that were meant to provide care or protection, and the research on its effects consistently finds that it adds a dimension to the original trauma that complicates recovery in specific ways. When the people responsible for your care use that care as a framework for causing additional harm, the basic trust in institutional support that most psychological recovery relies on is itself damaged. The pathway back toward health becomes complicated by the awareness that the institutions designed to provide that pathway have already proven themselves willing to exploit rather than support. Isaac's recovery from everything that happened to him between Dead Space and Dead Space 2 would require, at minimum, processing the original trauma of the Ishimura, processing the grief over Nicole that was never given space to resolve, processing the institutional betrayal of Project Telomere, and doing all of this while the marker's imprint remained active in his brain, and the Nicole hallucination continued operating at the level the marker had installed it. At the end of Dead Space 2, he uses the machine on himself, voluntarily this time, in full knowledge of what it is and what it does. He uses it to activate the imprinted blueprint fully enough to destroy the Site-12 marker, confronting the hallucination of Nicole in the process in a way that is as close to a genuine therapeutic confrontation of the traumatic material as anything the franchise offers him. It works. He survives. The marker is destroyed, and he does not get to recover because Dead Space 3 exists and the world is ending. What Isaac Clarke's complete arc reveals across all 3 games is something about the relationship between trauma and time that the franchise states clearly, even if it doesn't always state it explicitly. Trauma without treatment does not resolve on its own. It sits, it waits, it accumulates compound interest in the form of hypervigilance, emotional dysregulation, interpersonal difficulty, and the ongoing cost of keeping the unprocessed material partitioned. And when institutions that should provide treatment instead decide the trauma is more useful as a resource, the result is not simply a failure to help. The result is a compounding of the harm, a deepening of the damage, and a person who arrives at the next crisis carrying not just the original weight, but the weight of every year they were prevented from setting it down. The marker found Isaac's grief and used it. EarthGov found his damaged mind and used it. Both of them called what they were doing necessary. That parallel is not subtle. Dead Space is not subtle about it, and it is the specific observation that makes the franchise's horror genuinely systemic rather than simply monstrous. Chapter 13. Grief was always the weapon. Take a step back from the individual characters for a moment. Take a step back from Isaac and Kine and Strauss and Mercer and Matthias and Carver and Danik and the colony and the church. Pull back far enough to see the whole picture at once, because there is a pattern running through every breakdown in this franchise, every individual and collective psychological collapse, every moment where a mind comes apart, or a community fractures, or an institution betrays the people it claimed to serve. The pattern is specific enough that once you see it, you can't unsee it. The marker does not create vulnerability in the people it destroys. It finds vulnerability that already exists, and then it uses that vulnerability as the mechanism of destruction. This is the thing the Dead Space franchise has been building toward from the moment the Aegis VII colonists' sleep first started to fail. Every character whose mind the marker reaches comes to that encounter already carrying something. Isaac carries grief and guilt over unresolved loss. Kine carries the grief of years of widowhood, managed and adapted to but never fully resolved. Strauss carries guilt of a specific and unbearable kind, partitioned behind a dissociative structure he built to survive the knowledge of what he had done. Mercer carries an ideology so thoroughly integrated into his identity that it had already converted cruelty into purpose before the marker ever reached him. Matthias carries certainty organized around a mission that his faith had made non-negotiable. Carver carries survivor's guilt in the specific form that military service and sudden family loss produce together. Danik carries a belief system organized around the management of death anxiety, so complete and so identity-fused that revision was more costly than destruction. None of these were simple weaknesses. Most of them were, in the right context, with the right support, conditions that could have been lived with, processed, integrated, and survived without catastrophe. Grief is not a pathology. Guilt is not a pathology. Even the more complex presentations, the dissociative coping Strauss built, the motivated reasoning Danik relied on, the ideology Mercer organized himself around, these exist in real people living real lives who never become threats to anyone. The conditions for breakdown were not inherent to the wounds themselves. The marker made them inherent by removing everything that might have allowed the wounds to heal. This is where the franchise's horror sits at its deepest level, and it is the observation that gives Dead Space its staying power beyond the creature design and the atmosphere. The marker is not simply a supernatural villain, it is a precise and methodical exploiter of the specific psychological condition that makes humans most dangerous to themselves and each other. The condition of being in pain, alone, without adequate support, in an environment that has stripped away every resource that might have allowed adaptation. Grief specifically appears as the signal's most reliable entry point across the franchise, because grief is universal in a way that other psychological vulnerabilities are not. Almost every person who has lived long enough has experienced the loss of someone they loved. Almost every person who has experienced that loss has carried the specific weight of unresolved moments, the things unsaid, the conflicts not resolved, the repair not completed before the last call dropped. Grief of this kind does not require any pre-existing disorder. It does not require any particular history of trauma or instability. It requires only having loved someone and having lost them in the way that love and loss happen, which is imperfectly and in the middle of everything else, and without adequate time to prepare. The marker found this in Isaac, in Kine, in Carver, in Strauss at a level removed. Grief was not a bug in their psychology that made them uniquely vulnerable. It was the common human condition that the signal recognized as the most universally available entry point. Build a hallucination from the archive of the dead person that the living person carries. Make it warm enough to feel like presence rather than absence. Make it authoritative enough to feel like guidance. and the person, desperate for exactly this, will follow it. Think of it this way. The marker's approach to grief is something like what a predator does with camouflage. The camouflage is not impressive because it is complex. It is impressive because it is perfectly calibrated to the environment in which it is being deployed. The marker's grief hallucinations are calibrated to the specific internal environment of each person they are deployed within, assembled from that person's own emotional archive, so that they do not feel like external intrusions, but like returning presences. The person who is being used cannot feel the mechanism because the mechanism is made of themselves. What this reveals about the franchise's overall argument, taken as a whole across 3 games, is something more nuanced than a simple warning about supernatural artifacts. Dead Space is making an observation about the relationship between psychological vulnerability and the systems that surround it. The marker is the most visible and dramatic example of a system that identifies wounds and uses them rather than healing them. But EarthGov is another example. The Church of Unitology is another. The Aegis VII colony's working environment, which produced the isolation and stress that made the population so readily available to the signal's effects, is another. Every system in the Dead Space universe that interacts with human psychological vulnerability treats that vulnerability as a resource rather than a condition requiring support. The research literature on what institutional psychologists call secondary traumatization, the specific harm caused not by the original traumatic event but by the response of institutions to the person who experienced it, documents this pattern in real-world contexts. Survivors of major trauma who encounter institutions that dismiss, minimize, exploit, or further harm them experience a specific category of damage that compounds the original. The institution's failure is not neutral. It does not simply fail to help. It actively extends the duration and depth of the damage by foreclosing on the healing that should have been possible. Project Telomere is the most concentrated example of this in Dead Space, because it takes a person who survived something catastrophic, who needed real support and got none, and then spent 3 years extracting value from his damage while calling it medical care. But the Church of Unitology was doing the same thing at a larger scale and over a longer period, converting the grief and death anxiety of its members into commitment to a cause that would consume them. The Aegis VII colony's management structure did the same thing by failing to recognize and respond to the early psychological deterioration in its workforce, until intervention was no longer possible. The marker does this most efficiently, but it learned the technique from the human institutions that surrounded it. There is a real-world resonance to this argument that extends beyond horror gaming. The research on organizations that exploit psychological vulnerability, whether commercial, religious, political, or governmental, consistently finds the same structural features. They identify the wounds their targets are carrying. They offer something that appears to address those wounds. They extract value from the engagement while providing the minimum necessary to maintain commitment, and they organize themselves to prevent the kind of clear-eyed examination that would allow their targets to recognize the extraction for what it is. The specific domain changes. The structure does not. Dead Space is not at its core about alien artifacts and the biological horror of necromorphs. At its core, it is about what happens to people when the systems around them treat their pain as a resource. The necromorphs are what happens at the end of that process. The people they were made from are what the process looks like at the beginning. Every mental disorder in Dead Space was already present, in some form, before the marker arrived. Isaac's grief was already there. Kyne's grief was already there. Strauss's guilt was already there. Mercer's ideology was already there. Matthias's certainty was already there. Carver's survivor's guilt was already there. What the marker added was precision and pressure. It found the point where each wound was most accessible and pressed until something gave. But here is the observation that the franchise earns across its full run, the one that changes the reading of every breakdown examined in this script. In almost every case, the breakdown could have been interrupted. Not easily, not without resources that the specific circumstances often didn't provide. But the progression from wound to breakdown was not inevitable. It moved through stages that, with appropriate recognition and response, could have been caught. The insomnia stage. The paranoia stage, the first appearance of hallucinations, the increasing disconnection from the capacity to self-correct. At each stage, intervention was theoretically possible. What prevented it, in almost every case, was not the marker's power, but the absence of the structures that would have allowed the intervention to happen. The absence of psychological support in isolated industrial environments, the absence of ethical oversight in research facilities, the absence of genuine care in institutions that use the language of care to frame their exploitation, the absence, in Danick's case, of the kind of honest community that would have allowed him to examine his beliefs against their outcomes, rather than reinforcing them against incoming evidence. The marker is the most dramatic villain in Dead Space. But the most persistent villain is the gap between what people needed and what the systems around them provided. This is why the franchise endures as something more than a competent horror series with good creature design. It has something to say about what minds require to stay intact under pressure, about what happens when those requirements go unmet, and about the specific category of horror that occurs not when something inhuman reaches into a person's mind, but when something institutional does the same thing with better paperwork. Every breakdown in Dead Space was loaded before the signal fired. The wound came first, the signal just found it, and the question the franchise leaves hanging, the one without a clean answer across all three games and their aftermath, is whether knowing this changes anything. Whether the understanding that vulnerability is universal, that grief is a mechanism that can be exploited as readily as it can be survived, that the systems we build to support recovery can become instruments of additional harm, whether any of that awareness provides protection against the next version of what the marker represents. Isaac Clarke survived. He escaped the Ishimura, survived Titan Station, outlasted Tau Volantis. By the end of Dead Space 3, with the Brethren moons descending toward Earth, his survival becomes the franchise's most persistent question. What is survival worth when the systems that should have helped you recover instead harvested your damage for their own purposes? The franchise does not answer this. The final chapter of Isaac's story remains unresolved within the canon. He is last seen watching the moons arrive with John Carver beside him. The ending of everything. The thing they couldn't stop despite everything they endured to try to stop it. What he carried through all three games. The grief over Nicole. The guilt over what he said to her. The 3 years of institutional betrayal he can never fully account for. The marker's imprint that still sits somewhere in whatever is left of his neural architecture. None of it gets resolved in any clean sense. The ending does not give him closure, it gives him company. Carver, who also carries his dead and has also been failed by the institutions around him, watches the same horizon. There is something worth holding on to in that, even without the clean ending. Two people who were both used by the systems that found them, both broken in specific and personal ways, both carrying the dead that the marker built hallucinations from, watching the end come together, not healed, not fixed, still carrying everything, but not alone. In the real world, outside the Dead Space universe, the research on recovery from complex and sustained trauma is clear that the most consistently significant protective factor is relational, not the elimination of the wound, not the resolution of grief, not the cessation of all psychological difficulty. What protects people most is the presence of genuine relational support, the experience of being known by someone who does not find the wound useful, but who finds the person worth knowing regardless. Every character the marker destroyed in this franchise was, at the moment of their most acute vulnerability, alone with what they were carrying. Isaac was alone on the Ishimura. Kyne was alone in his grief for 7 years before the marker found it. Strauss was alone with the unbearable knowledge of what he had done, a partition that protected him from it, but also prevented anyone from helping him process it. Mercer was alone inside an ideology that had sealed itself against external input. The colonists of Aegis VII were alone in a community that had no architecture for recognizing collective psychological deterioration. What the marker found again and again was isolation wearing different faces. Grief alone, guilt alone, certainty alone. The specific texture of the aloneness changed from person to person. The aloneness itself did not. And what Dead Space examined from this angle is quietly arguing across all three of its games is that the wound is not the problem. The wound in isolation is survivable. The wound in a context of genuine support, of being known rather than processed, of receiving care that serves the person rather than extracting from them, is something most people can survive and eventually integrate. The wound alone, without that context, left in the specific isolation that industrial work and institutional exploitation and sealed ideology all produce in different ways, is what the marker was always looking for. It didn't need to manufacture the conditions for breakdown. Humanity had been manufacturing them for long enough that they were everywhere the signal looked. Everything we've examined tonight comes back to one thing. The marker didn't need extraordinary power over human minds. It needed ordinary wounds and ordinary isolation and the specific failure of the systems that should have addressed both. It found all of those things in every game, in every character, in every community it reached. Dead Space is a horror franchise, but the thing underneath the horror, the mechanism the franchise keeps returning to, is as real and as present and as exploitable as anything in the lore. The wound comes first. The signal just finds it.